My grandmother's house smelled like lavender and old paperwork, which, looking back, was either poetic or a warning. I grew up in a family where love was distributed like a budget, enough to look generous. Never quite enough to be fair. My mother was good at that. She had a talent for making you feel almost included. Just close enough to the warmth that you didn't notice you were still standing outside. My brother was the fireplace. Everyone crowded around him without thinking about it. Derek was 3 years older, louder, and perpetually in some kind of becoming. Mom called him a visionary. The rest of us called it unemployment with ambition. He'd started 4 businesses since college, a food truck, a drop-shipping store, something involving cryptocurrency that no one could explain at Thanksgiving, and most recently, a real estate investment group that had exactly 2 members, himself and whoever he could charm at a networking mixer. Dad, my stepdad. Actually, a man named Gerald, who'd been in our lives since I was 11, funded most of it. Quietly. The way people fund things they know won't work but can't stop themselves from believing in. I was different. I always had been. I went to school for accounting, which at family dinners was the equivalent of saying you'd decided to become a parking meter. My mother once introduced me to her book club as the one who does taxes, the way someone might apologize for a weird smell. I worked for the IRS specifically, the Criminal Investigation Division. I analyzed financial patterns, traced asset concealment, and helped build fraud cases that eventually ended in federal prosecution. It was precise work. Important work. The kind that made headlines only when someone else got the credit. But at family gatherings, I was still the one who remembered to bring the napkins. I wasn't supposed to be staying at my mother's house that fall. My apartment in the city had a pipe burst, the kind of catastrophic, ceiling collapsing disaster that your renter's insurance describes as covered and your contractor describes as 6 to 8 weeks. Minimum. So there I was, back in my childhood bedroom with a duffel bag and a laptop, trying to remember that it was temporary. I had a cot, a good Wi-Fi password, and absolutely no reason to be there past October. My grandmother passed in September. She was 83. Sharp until the very end. The kind of woman who kept her important documents in labeled folders and her opinions in a sharper filing system. She'd outlived 1 husband, 2 dogs, and apparently my family's ability to behave like adults when money was involved. She left behind a house, a small investment portfolio, and a will that had been drafted 12 years ago by her attorney, a man named Walter Chung, whose office smelled like cedar and competence. The estate reading was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon. I drove from my mother's house with a coffee I hadn't finished and a quiet certainty that something would go wrong. That's not pessimism. That's pattern recognition. You spend enough years reading financial forensics, and you start to see the seams in things, places where the numbers don't line up, where people's behavior tells a different story than their paperwork. Walter Chung's office was small and organized. There were 4 of us, my mother, my brother, a cousin named Patricia who'd flown in from Portland, and me. My mother wore pearls, which she saved for occasions she considered significant. My brother wore a blazer over a wrinkled shirt, which he considered close enough. Walter read the will carefully. My grandmother had been specific. The house would be sold and the proceeds split 4 ways evenly among her 4 grandchildren. That meant me, Derek, Patricia, and a cousin named Marcus who lived in Atlanta and couldn't attend. The investment portfolio had a separate trustee directive. Also clear. Also evenly divided with a stipulation for a 6-month probate review. Derek nodded along with the kind of practiced calm that I'd learned over years of working financial investigations. Meant someone was processing numbers in real time. After the reading, walking to our cars, my mother touched my arm. She always touched your arm when she wanted to tell you something she'd already decided. Honey, she said, Derek's been going through a hard time. You know how business can be. I looked at her. I didn't say anything yet, because I was still in the information gathering phase. She continued. He mentioned maybe talking to Patricia about a different arrangement. Something more flexible. Something that takes into account who's really been here. Supporting the family. I asked her what that meant. She said, "You know what it means." I did. It meant Derek wanted a larger share. It meant my mother was the advance team. And it meant they'd already had this conversation without me. I smiled and said I'd think about it. Which was true. I thought about it for about 45 seconds before filing it in the same folder. I kept everything from that family labeled carefully. Never closed. The next few weeks had a familiar rhythm. I worked remotely from the guest room, which meant I could hear everything happening downstairs. Derek came over most afternoons, which told me he wasn't busy with anything that required showing up somewhere. He and my mother would sit at the kitchen table and talk in that half-lowered voice that isn't actually quiet but thinks it is. I caught fragments. Attorney. Signature. Just a formality. Easier this way. Once I heard my mother say, "She won't even notice." She was wrong about that. 2. One evening I came downstairs for water and found them at the table with a document spread between them. My brother saw me first. He closed the folder. Not dramatically, just a casual slide and stack. The way someone moves papers when they're trying to look like they're not moving papers. My mother looked up and smiled. "Just estate stuff," she said. "So boring." I said. "Sûr." I filled my glass and went back upstairs. At my desk, I opened a spreadsheet and started a timeline. Old habit. You don't investigate fraud for a living without building a timeline. The next morning, I called Patricia in Portland. She hadn't heard from anyone since the reading. She hadn't been asked to sign anything. She hadn't been offered any flexible arrangements. I asked her to check her email and call me back if she received any documents from an address she didn't recognize. She asked if everything was okay. I said I was being thorough. 2 days later, she called me back. There was an email. It looked official letterhead. Formatting. Everything but the domain was off. Instead of Walter Chung's actual firm address, it came from a slightly different variation. One transposed letter. The kind of thing you'd miss on a quick scan. Attached was a document requesting her signature on what appeared to be a simplified estate distribution amendment. It would have reallocated her share and Marcus's share into a jointly managed trust administered by my brother. I read it 3 times. Then I forwarded it to myself, printed a copy, and sat with it for a long moment. I want to be clear about something. This wasn't a moment of rage. There was no dramatic confrontation. No yelling. No throwing anything. I'd spent years in a job where the most dangerous thing you could do was let your emotions contaminate your evidence chain. Anger is a leak. You patch it and you work. I called Walter Chung's actual office. His assistant confirmed that no amendment had been filed. No additional documents had been sent. And the email address used was not theirs. I asked her to document that confirmation in writing. She said she'd send it within the hour. She did. Then I opened the IRS referral intake portal. For 13949A. It's the form used to report suspected tax fraud and financial crimes to the Criminal Investigation Division. You fill it out. Attach your supporting documentation. And submit. It takes about 8 minutes if you know what you're doing. I knew what I was doing. I also called Marcus in Atlanta. He hadn't received anything either. He was quiet for a moment. Then said, "This is Derek." "Isn't it?" I said I was still gathering information. He said, "I've been gathering information on Derek since 2019. We agreed to stay in contact." That evening I came downstairs to dinner. My mother had made pot roast, which she reserved for occasions she wanted to feel warm and domestic. Derek was already at the table, helping himself to bread. He looked comfortable. He looked like a man who'd just solved a problem. My mother set a plate in front of me. She asked how my work was going. I said busy. She asked if I'd thought more about the estate arrangement. I said I was still reviewing everything carefully. Derek looked at me with that expression he used when he thought he was being charming. "Claire," he said. "Nobody's trying to cut you out. It's just logistics. You're never around. You don't need the hassle of managing a split estate. I'm the one who's been here." I looked at him. I said, "I appreciate you explaining that." He laughed. Mom laughed. I ate my pot roast. After dinner, my mother cornered me in the kitchen while I was loading dishes. "Emma." She started and then corrected herself. "Claire." She had a habit of mixing up names when she was nervous. She said, "I just want everyone to get what they need. Derek's been struggling. You have a good salary. You have stability. I don't think it's wrong to ask you to consider the bigger picture." I turned around. I said, "Mom, I'm always considering the bigger picture." She seemed reassured by that. She shouldn't have been. The next morning I had a call with my supervisor, which I took from my car in the driveway. I explained the situation in terms he recognized immediately: fraudulent document creation, impersonation of a legal entity, attempted estate fraud, and possible wire fraud, given the email transmission across state lines. He asked if I had documentation. I said I had a timeline, a confirmed false domain, original email headers, 2 witnesses who hadn't signed anything, and a written statement from the actual estate attorney. He said, You have to recuse from any official capacity on this." "Right," I said. I'd already figured that. He connected me to a colleague named Agent Torres, who handled financial crimes out of the field office 60 miles away. Agent Torres was thorough and unhurried, which I respected. We spoke for an hour. I transferred my documentation. He said they'd open a preliminary inquiry and reach out to Walter Chung's office independently. I said I understood. He said, "Off the record, this is remarkably clean documentation for a personal matter." I said I'd had some practice. 2 weeks passed. The estate was held in probate, which would have happened anyway. Patricia received a call from Agent Torres. Marcus received a call from Agent Torres. I received a call from Walter Chung, who was politely furious about the impersonation of his firm and had already filed his own complaint. Derek received a visit. I wasn't there when it happened. I was at my desk working on an unrelated case when my mother called me 6 times in 45 minutes. I let it go to voicemail. Then she texted, "Call me right now, it's an emergency." I called back. She was barely coherent. People were at the house, asking questions, going through Derek's things. "You need to fix this. You need to tell them it's a misunderstanding." I said, "Mom, I can't interfere in a federal inquiry." She went quiet. Then, very carefully, she said, "Did you do this?" I said. I documented what I found and reported it to the appropriate channels. She said, "He's your brother." I said, "He impersonated a federal law firm and attempted to defraud 4 people out of inheritance money." She was crying by then. The way she cried when she wanted you to feel responsible for her pain. She said, "I thought you had more loyalty than this." I said, "I have a great deal of loyalty. To the law. To Grandma's actual wishes. To Patricia and Marcus, who never did anything to deserve this." She hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment, then set it on the desk and went back to work. The next few days had a texture I recognized from my cases at work, that specific pressure of a situation moving through official channels while the people involved hadn't quite accepted it was real. My mother called twice more. I answered once. She told me Derek said it was all a misunderstanding, that the document had been drafted by someone he'd hired and he hadn't reviewed it carefully, that he didn't know. That I was destroying the family over a paperwork mistake. I asked her if she believed that. She said, "He's my son." I said, "That's not an answer." She said, "I just need you to tell them he didn't mean it. That it was confusion. You can do that. You have access. You know people." I said, "What I have is a federal obligation to report accurate information. Using my access to interfere with an inquiry would be a crime. I'd be investigating myself next." She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "You've always been this way. So cold. So precise. Like you don't even care that this is your family." I said, "I care exactly this much enough to tell the truth and let the process work." She cried again. Ileta. Then I said I had to get back to work. And I ended the call. What people outside this kind of situation don't always understand is that the hardest part isn't the confrontation. The confrontation is almost a relief. It's clean. It's defined. You know exactly what's in front of you. The hard part is the days after. When the noise starts. When the people who should be appalled on your behalf become, instead, the people demanding you explain yourself. My mother told extended family that I'd reported my own brother to the government out of jealousy. She told her neighbor that the IRS was targeting Derek because of a personal grudge. She called our aunt in Florida and cried for 40 minutes about how I'd become unreachable. Somewhere in that week, a cousin I hadn't spoken to in 3 years sent me a Facebook message that said, "What kind of person does this to their family?" I didn't respond to any of it. I archived it. It's the way you archive things that have evidentiary value but don't require your attention right now. Agent Torres called me 2 weeks into the inquiry to give me an update. I couldn't act on professionally but could receive personally. He said they'd found additional documentation. The false email wasn't the only instrument. There was a backdated letter in Derek's files. Printed on paper that matched a letterhead template, he'd downloaded a template designed to resemble Walter Chung's firm stationery. There were text messages on his phone indicating my mother had known about the strategy. Not the forgery specifically, but the plan to adjust the distribution before anything was officially filed. I asked what that meant for her. He said it was being reviewed. He said, "Your documentation made this significantly more straightforward than most cases we see." I thanked him. He said I should probably find a more permanent place to stay. I said I was already looking. I found an apartment 2 weeks later. A good 1/3 floor. Decent light. Close enough to the field office that my commute was manageable. I packed my duffel on a Thursday morning while my mother was at her book club. I left a note on the kitchen counter that said, "I hope you understand." Eventually, that this was never about the money. I went upstairs one more time. Looked at the room where I'd grown up, the same twin bed. The same window that looked over a backyard that had always seemed smaller than I remembered, and I closed the door. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel grief. I felt the particular clarity that comes when you stop waiting for people to become who you needed them to be and start accepting who they actually are. The formal charges came 6 weeks after that. Derek was charged with wire fraud, forgery of a legal instrument, and attempted estate fraud, 3 counts. Federal level, the assistant U.S. attorney on the case was efficient and prepared. Walter Chung cooperated fully. Patricia and Marcus both provided statements. The evidence chain was clean. My mother hired a private attorney. Not for herself but for Derek. Because the public defender, she said, wouldn't be aggressive enough. She liquidated a CD she'd been holding since 2011 to pay the retainer. I found out through Patricia, who heard it from the cousin in Florida. I didn't have feelings about it that I could name cleanly. Maybe sadness. The kind that doesn't move. I attended the preliminary hearing because I was listed as a witness on the documentation chain. I sat in a chair that was too hard and drank water from a paper cup and waited to be called. My mother was there. 2 rows behind the defense table. In pearls again. She didn't look at me. My brother looked older than I remembered. which happened to people when consequences caught up to them. His attorney was competent but working with a thin hand. The government's case was presented in about 40 minutes. The forensic accounting analysis I'd flagged was submitted into evidence. Agent Torres testified. Walter Chung testified. Patricia, via video link from Portland, testified. When it was my turn, I answered every question directly. I did not elaborate beyond what was asked. I did not look at my brother more than once. I did not look at my mother at all. Derek's attorney tried a familiar argument that the document was a draft, that no actual harm had occurred since no one had signed it. That intent was ambiguous. The judge? A woman with close cropped hair and reading glasses, she kept folding and unfolding. Looked at the attorney with the expression of someone who had been doing this for a very long time and was not easily impressed by thin arguments. She said, "Counsel, your client used a spoofed domain to transmit a forged legal document to out-of-state recipients. That crosses 3 jurisdictions before we even get to intent." She wasn't wrong. The final sentencing came on a February afternoon. Cold and gray in the way February afternoons insist on being. Derek received 14 months in federal custody. 3 years of probation. Full restitution to cover the estate's legal costs and the attorney fees Walter Chung's firm had incurred responding to the investigation, and a permanent bar from serving as a fiduciary or estate administrator. It wasn't the harshest sentence the statute allowed. It was proportionate, which is what the law is supposed to be. My mother didn't cry in the courtroom. She saved that for the parking lot, where I heard her. Briefly, as I walked past on my way to my car, she called my name once. I stopped. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, she was the same woman she'd always been, but something in her posture had collapsed in a way that was hard to watch. She said, "I hope you're satisfied." I said, "I didn't do this to be satisfied." She said, "Then why?" I thought about it for a moment. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wanted to give her the real one, not the easy one. I said, "Because Grandma was specific about what she wanted. Because Patricia and Marcus never did anything wrong. And because if I'd looked the other way, I would have spent the rest of my life knowing I was the kind of person who does that." She shook her head slowly. She said, "I don't know who you became." I said, "I think you do. You just didn't expect it to come back around." She didn't respond. I got in my car, adjusted the mirrors out of habit, and drove home. My apartment was quiet when I got in. The good kind of quiet, not tense. Not loaded. Just empty in the way that empty can mean clean. I made coffee I didn't need and sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, to nothing in particular. Outside, the last of the light was fading. That blue-gray hour between afternoon and dark when everything looks temporary. I opened my email. There was a message from Patricia. It said simply, "Thank you for being the person who does the right thing when it's hard." Marcus had sent one too, forwarded from his own attorney, confirming the estate was now processing on schedule and that all 4 shares would be distributed as Grandma intended. There was also an email from a return address I recognized as my mother's. I looked at the subject line. It said, "Please read this," and then I moved it to a folder I'd labeled. Simply, Laughter. I didn't know if later would ever come. That was honest. Some things take longer than a verdict to resolve. Some things don't resolve at all. Just rearrange into something you can carry differently. But I'd learned something in those months that I hadn't had a word for before, which was that there's a difference between forgiveness and folding. I wasn't cold. I wasn't unfeeling. I had felt every bit of it, the sting of my mother choosing him. The hollow sound of Derek's voice trying to be casual while he closed a folder. The particular loneliness of being in a family that treated your integrity as a personality flaw. I felt all of it. I just didn't let it make the decisions. Back at the office the following week, I was assigned a new case, a complicated one. multiple entities, offshore holding patterns, the kind of thing that would take months to untangle. I sat at my desk with a fresh cup of coffee and a blank timeline spreadsheet and felt, without reservation, exactly where I was supposed to be. A colleague stopped by my desk that afternoon. She said she'd heard, through the quiet channels that offices have, that I'd been involved in a personal matter that intersected with the job. She said, "That must have been hard." I said, "It was." She said, "How do you feel now?" I thought about it. Not about the sentencing or the courtroom or the parking lot where my mother looked smaller than she used to. I thought about Grandma's will in its original folder, dated and signed and clear. I thought about Walter Chung's firm statement arriving in my inbox exactly when I needed it. I thought about the 4 equal shares, distributed as intended, with no one's thumb on the scale. I said, "I feel like the system worked." She nodded like she understood. Because she did. That was the thing about this job. The people who stayed in it long term were the ones who could hold both things at once, the mess of human beings doing human things to each other, and the steady, impersonal structure that existed specifically to catch it. You didn't have to love people perfectly. You just had to document them honestly. I went back to my spreadsheet. Outside the window, the city was going about its business, indifferent and continuous. In my desk drawer, under a stack of case files, was a card from Walter Chung's office. It had arrived 2 weeks after the sentencing, handwritten on firm letterhead. It said, "Your grandmother would have approved. She always said clarity was the most respectful thing you could give someone." I hadn't put it up anywhere. I didn't need to. I'd read it twice and that was enough. The week my grandmother's estate was officially closed, I drove out to her house, the one being sold as part of the distribution on a Sunday morning before anyone else was scheduled to be there. I used the key I still had from helping her clean gutters 2 summers ago. The house was quiet and a little dusty. The furniture covered in white sheets, and the lavender smell mostly gone but still there in the walls if you paid attention. I walked through each room slowly. The kitchen where she'd taught me to balance a checkbook before I was 12. The back porch where she used to say, "The truth doesn't need decoration, honey. It just needs to be said clearly." The hallway where her documents had always been in labeled folders on a shelf, everything organized, everything accounted for, nothing hidden. I stood there for a while and didn't feel sad. Exactly. I felt something closer to gratitude. She'd known what she wanted. She'd put it in writing. She'd trusted the system to hold it. I'd just made sure someone was paying attention. I locked the door on the way out, dropped the key in an envelope for the estate attorney, and drove back to my apartment with the windows down and the radio off and the city opening up ahead of me. Specific and mine.